Welcome to a deep dive into technofeudalism.
Oh,
We're going to be exploring economist Yanis Varoufakis' book,
okay.
Technofeudalism: What Killed Capitalism, to understand how technology is reshaping power and economics in a way that might surprise you.
Right.
I have to admit, even the title of the book had me intrigued.
Yeah.
Is capitalism really dead? What even is technofeudalism?
Yeah.
Luckily, we have an expert here to help unpack all of this.
Yeah. Varoufakis makes a pretty bold claim in the book.
Yeah.
And it's one that really forces us to rethink how we view the digital economy.
Yeah.
And to understand his argument, we need to kind of trace the evolution of capitalism itself.
And that makes sense. It's like we need a map before we can go
Right.
exploring uncharted territory, right?
Exactly, yeah.
The book starts with a fascinating anecdote about Varoufakis' own childhood. His father, a chemical engineer and a bit of a philosopher, used to teach young Giannis about technology using a home forge and the poetry of Hesiod.
Wow. That's a powerful image, isn't it? The forge represents the potential of technology to create and build, but also its potential to destroy. And Hesiod's poetry, which often deals with themes of labor and struggle, adds another layer to this whole idea.
This gets to the heart of the question Varoufakis grapples with throughout the book.
Hmm.
Can we, as humans, truly master technology? Or
Hmm.
will it end up mastering us?
Right.
And, I started thinking about my own experiences with technology, how much time I spend online, how reliant I am on my phone. And it really made me wonder who's in control here.
That's exactly the kind of self-reflection Varoufakis is trying to provoke. He argues that to understand techno-feudalism, we need to understand the stages of capitalism that preceded it. It's like each stage laid a stepping stone toward this new system.
So walk us through those stages. Where does this journey through capitalism begin?
Sure. So it starts with early capitalism, where things like land and labor, things that were once considered common goods, were turned into commodities to be bought and sold. The ability to command capital became a new source of power. But here's the crucial point. This system created winners and losers. And over time, the gap between them widened.
That makes sense. We often think of capitalism as this engine of progress, but it sounds like those benefits weren't equally distributed.
Precisely. And things shifted dramatically during World War II. The war effort led to the rise of huge corporations, blurring the lines between government and business. This is what Varoufakis calls the technostructure.
Okay.
Think about figures like John Maynard Keynes, who argued for a more active role for government in managing the economy. His ideas had a massive impact on the post-war world.
So we see the seeds of big government and big business being sown during this period. But how did this lead to what we have today?
Well, the next stage Varoufakis outlines is the global minotaur. This is where the U.S. dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. And the U.S. essentially becomes this giant consumer while the rest of the world produces. This system had inherent imbalances. That ultimately led to what we call financialization.
So finance starts to call the shots, and we see a disconnect between hard work and rising living standards.
Right.
This is where that feeling of working harder but getting nowhere comes from, right?
Yeah.
And didn't this set the stage for the 2008 crash?
Yes, exactly. The 2008 crash exposed the vulnerabilities of this financialized system. But instead of fixing the underlying problems, we doubled down on the same policies. And this is where things get really interesting. Because according to Varoufakis, we entered a new phase, one that's distinct from capitalism, not just a continuation of it.
This is where cloud capital comes in, right? This new form of capital driven by data and algorithms.
Exactly.
But how is cloud capital different from the capital that drove those earlier stages of capitalism? It still seems like we're talking about companies making money.
It's different in a fundamental way. Think about companies like Google and Facebook. They aren't just selling products, they're selling access to our attention. They're collecting our data and using it to shape our behavior, to influence our choices. Varoufakis argues that this cloud capital has the power to manufacture desire, to create needs we didn't even know we had.
That's a little unsettling when you put it like that. It reminds me of that show Mad Men, where Don Draper was so good at understanding and manipulating human desire. Is it kind of like that, but on a much larger scale?
That's a great analogy. Don Draper might have been a master manipulator, but cloud capital takes it to a whole new level. Algorithms are constantly learning from our behavior, refining their techniques to keep us engaged, to keep us scrolling, to keep us clicking and buying.
So instead of billboards and TV commercials, we have these invisible algorithms whispering in our ears, subtly shaping our desires. It's like a new form of subliminal advertising. And this brings us to the enclosure of the internet. I remember when the internet first became popular, it felt like this open frontier, a place for free expression and collaboration.
Right. It was built on open protocols, freely accessible to anyone. It was a digital commons.
But somewhere along the way that changed. Big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook moved in and started fencing off portions of that digital landscape.
Exactly. They took what was once a shared resource
Right.
and turned it into a series of cloud fiefs. They control access, they set the rules, and they extract value from our online activities.
It's like we went from homesteading on the digital frontier to being sharecroppers on someone else's digital plantation. We might have some freedoms, but ultimately we're working for the benefit of the cloud landlord.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it gets to the heart of what Varoufakis calls technofeudalism. This isn't just capitalism on steroids. It's a new system with its own rules and its own power dynamics.
So help us understand this new system. How is technofeudalism different from capitalism?
The key difference is the shift from profit to cloud rent. Think about companies like Apple and Google. They're not just selling products anymore, they're controlling entire ecosystems.
Okay, give me some concrete examples of this cloud rent. What does that actually look like in the real world?
Think about the Apple App Store. Apple takes a 30% cut of every sale made through their platform. Or look at Amazon's marketplace. They charge sellers fees to list their products and take a cut of each sale. These are forms of cloud rent. And for companies like Apple and Amazon, it's become a massive source of revenue.
So we've gone from these competitive markets where, at least in theory, anyone could participate, to these walled gardens controlled by a handful of incredibly powerful companies.
Right.
And what's even more concerning is that for these cloudalists, as Varoufakis calls them, profit is almost becoming optional.
That's a key insight that Varoufakis highlights. Remember how central banks started printing massive amounts of money after the 2008 crisis?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of that money ended up flowing to big tech. They were able to amass huge amounts of cloud capital. And because of its unique features, its ability to extract rent from users and vassal capitalists, profit became less of a driving force.
So instead of focusing on selling products and making a profit, they're focusing on controlling platforms, collecting data, and extracting rent. It's like they've figured out a way to make money without actually needing to sell anything.
Exactly. And this has profound implications for the global economy.
This is where things start to get a little scary, right? Because if these companies don't need to make a profit to survive, they can play by a different set of rules.
Precisely. And that's what we're going to explore next, how this shift to technofeudalism is playing out on a global scale.
Expert speaker. Okay, so we've established that these cloudalists are playing by a different set of rules. What does this mean for the global economy? Are we heading towards some kind of dystopian future where a handful of tech giants rule the world?
Well, Varoufakis argues that we're already seeing the emergence of a new kind of Cold War, not between ideologies, but between competing systems of cloud capital.
So it's not just about the US versus China anymore. I have to admit, the news can get pretty tiring when it feels like every story is about those two countries going head to head.
It's more nuanced than that. China's rise as a cloud capital power definitely challenges the U.S.-led order. But it's not just about military might or even economic output. It's about who controls the platforms, the payment systems,
Yeah.
the currencies of the future.
Control over the flow of information and money. That makes sense. And the book talks about how the weaponization of finance is becoming a major tool in this new Cold War.
Absolutely. We've already seen this play out with the sanctions against Russia, the ability to freeze assets, to cut off access to global financial networks. It's incredibly powerful.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It seems like we're moving toward a world where economic power translates into political power in a very direct way. And what about the rest of the world? What about developing countries? How are they being impacted by this rise of technofeudalism?
They're facing a double whammy. On the one hand, the rise of cloud capital is exacerbating existing inequalities. And on the other hand, the global inflation we've been experiencing is hitting developing countries especially hard. They're facing a debt crisis, rising food and fuel prices. It's a perfect storm.
So we have this new Cold War brewing, the global south is struggling, and meanwhile, here in the developed world, we're busy scrolling through TikTok and ordering stuff on Amazon. It feels almost surreal, this disconnect between the big picture and our everyday lives. What does it actually mean to live under technofeudalism? How is it changing us, not just economically, but socially and psychologically?
This is where Varoufakis gets really insightful. He argues that our mental health, our attention spans, even our capacity for empathy are being eroded by this constant barrage of information and this relentless drive for engagement.
Okay, this is hitting close to home. I know I spend way too much time on my phone, and I often feel scattered and anxious. Is that what we're talking about here? Is this like a collective attention deficit disorder?
That's a great way to put it. It's like we're all becoming addicted to these little dopamine hits we get from likes and notifications.
Yeah.
And it's not just about our individual well-being. This has broader social and political implications.
Yeah, so.
Well, think about the rise of online extremism, the spread of misinformation, the increasing polarization of our societies. These are all in part fueled by the algorithms that drive these platforms. They're designed to keep us engaged, to keep us clicking and sharing, even if that means amplifying the most extreme and divisive content.
That makes sense. It's like these platforms are profiting off our outrage and division. The more we argue and fight online, the more engaged we become and the more money they make. And you know what's really scary is that I think Varoufakis is right when he talks about how both the left and the right are using identity politics to their advantage. They're manipulating people's anxieties and frustrations.
Exactly. The focus on identity, while important, can sometimes distract us from the underlying economic structures that are shaping our lives. And this is where technofeudalism comes in. It's a system that thrives on division, on keeping us distracted and fighting amongst ourselves, while the cloudalists continue to amass power and wealth.
So is there any hope? I mean, Varoufakis doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture of the future. Does he offer any solutions, any way out of this mess?
He doesn't sugarcoat the challenges,
Yeah.
that's for sure. He's very clear that we're facing a systemic crisis and that incremental reforms won't be enough. But he does offer some intriguing ideas about how we might reclaim control, how we might build a more democratic and equitable future.
All right, lay it on me. What's the plan? Because right now I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this. It feels like these forces are so much bigger than any one person.
I understand how you feel. But Varoufakis argues that we have more power than we realize. He says we need to fundamentally rethink the way we organize our economy, our political systems, even our relationship with technology.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty tall order. Where do we even begin?
He talks about things like democratizing money, creating a universal basic income, and establishing new forms of collective ownership that prioritize human needs over profit.
So we need a total system reboot? I can see how that would address some of the problems we've been talking about. But how would we actually implement these ideas? I mean, these are pretty radical changes.
He gets into some specifics. For example, he imagines a system where everyone has a digital wallet provided by the central bank. This would provide a basic income and would allow people to bypass the traditional banking system, which, as we discussed, has become increasingly extractive and prone to crises.
So we'd all have our own little piece of the monetary commons. It sounds interesting, but I have to admit I don't really understand how that would work in practice.
That's understandable. It's a complex idea and it would require a major shift in our thinking about money and finance. But Varoufakis lays out a pretty compelling case for why it's necessary. He argues that the current system is inherently unstable and that we need a more democratic and equitable way of managing our financial resources.
Okay, I'm willing to keep an open mind. What else does he propose?
He also talks about the need to democratize data. Right now, our data is being collected and exploited by these tech giants for their own profit. Varoufakis argues that we need to reclaim ownership of our data and use it for the collective good.
That makes sense. But how do we do that? I mean, these companies have such a tight grip on our data, it feels like we've already given it away.
He suggests exploring new technologies like blockchain, which can be used to create more decentralized and democratic platforms. Imagine a social media platform where users control the algorithms, where our data is used to benefit the community rather than corporations.
That would be a game changer. But let's be realistic. Is that even possible? I mean, these tech giants are so powerful. Can we really challenge their dominance?
Varoufakis believes we can. He reminds us that every system of power has its vulnerabilities.
Okay, so what's the weak spot? Where do we attack? Because honestly, it feels like they're winning right now.
Well, think about it. These cloudalists depend on our data, our attention, our participation in their platforms. What if we started to withdraw that consent? What if we started to build our own alternatives, our own digital commons?
You're saying we need to become more conscious consumers, more discerning about where we spend our time and money online.
Exactly. And it goes beyond individual choices. We need to start thinking about collective action, about organizing ourselves to demand greater transparency, accountability, and control over our digital lives.
So a kind of digital rebellion, a mass exodus from these platforms. That's a pretty bold idea.
It might sound radical, but it's not unprecedented. We've seen social movements throughout history challenge the power of entrenched institutions and the tools we have today. The internet, social media, decentralized technologies, they can be powerful weapons in this fight.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. But it's going to take a lot of people working together, right?
Exactly. This isn't about individual heroism. It's about collective action, about building a movement, a community of people who are committed to creating a better future.
So what's the first step? What can people do right now to get involved in this digital resistance?
Well, the first step is to become informed. Read Varoufakis' book, explore the resources he provides, and start to understand the dynamics of technofeudalism. Then start connecting with others who share your concerns. There are already many groups and organizations working on these issues. Find your tribe, join the conversation, and start taking action.
I love that find your tribe. It feels less overwhelming when you know you're not alone in this.
Right. We're all in this together. And remember, the future is not predetermined. It's up to us to shape it.
It's inspiring to think that we can reclaim our digital lives and shape a better future. But I have to admit, it's hard to imagine taking on these tech giants. They seem so entrenched, so powerful.
I understand your skepticism. It's a David and Goliath situation, no doubt. But remember, even Goliath had a weak spot. And these cloudalists, for all their power, are not invincible.
So where's their Achilles heel? What makes them vulnerable?
Their dependence on us. They need our data, our attention, our participation in their platforms to maintain their power. If we start to withdraw that consent, if we start to build alternatives, we can chip away at their foundations.
That makes sense. But it sounds like a long uphill battle. What are some concrete steps we can take to start building these alternatives?
Varoufakis talks about the potential of blockchain technology. I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but it could actually be a powerful tool for creating a more democratic and decentralized internet.
I've heard about blockchain, but I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I understand how it works. Is it like a digital ledger?
That's a good way to think about it.
Right.
It's a decentralized and transparent way of recording information and transactions. This makes it very difficult to manipulate or control.
So instead of Facebook deciding what we see and what we don't, we could have a platform where users have more control over the algorithms, the content, the overall direction of the community.
Exactly. And this ties into Varoufakis' vision of cosmodemocracy, a global system of governance that is more participatory, transparent, and accountable to the people.
Cosmodemocracy. That sounds ambitious, but also kind of amazing. How do we get from here to there? It's easy to talk about these grand ideas, but how do we actually start to implement them?
It won't be easy, that's for sure. It requires a shift in consciousness, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to collective action.
It sounds like we need a movement, a collective push for change.
Exactly. Varoufakis argues that we need to start by building movements, networks, and institutions that embody the values we want to see in the world.
So it's not about waiting for some top-down revolution. It's about starting from the bottom up, creating these pockets of resistance, these seeds of a new system that can eventually grow and challenge the dominance of technofeudalism.
Precisely. And it's already happening. We're seeing the emergence of new cooperatives, platform co-ops, and community-owned initiatives that are putting people and the planet before profit.
So there is hope, I have to say. This conversation has been a roller coaster of emotions, from feeling overwhelmed and powerless to feeling inspired and hopeful.
There's always hope,
Yeah.
but it requires us to be engaged, to be informed, and to be willing to fight for the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So to our listeners, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all this talk of techno-feudalism, remember you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not powerless. Pick up a copy of Technofeudalism, dive into those sources, and start asking yourself, what role can I play in shaping the future? The future isn't predetermined. It's up to us to write it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.